So you have this worksheet in your package, so we'll go through each piece of the assignment and you can compare your answers. So, a teacher-centered instructor job is mainly to give information. The transmission of content is the priority. You have a plan, you're going to deliver it. That's the bottom line. You want them to get to a certain point, a certain move, a certain pattern. That is the whole basis of how you're teaching, is to give the information. What the participants do with it isn't really a concern. You just want to get the information and transmit it onto them. Next is emphasis of moving and learning from errors and not perfection. So that's more student-centered. So the goal of a class is not to get to this final thing, but it's about the journey and the process and figuring it out, how their bodies work, how they can move, how they can manipulate, how they can interpret movement is much more student-focused as opposed to teacher-focused. Sometimes a teacher-centered instructor is mistaken as a performer. So they're doing their own thing, they're doing this fancy choreography, these complicated moves, these high-intense workouts, and no one else is doing it with them. So if you find yourself teaching a class and everyone's kind of standing and watching you, or they're not even close to what you're wanting to, what you're cueing, then likely you have to back it up and focus on the student. They're not getting something. So you have to revamp your approach and figure out what's not translating to them from your brain, what your idea is, and it's not happening and working for your participants. You have to figure that out. And there's nothing wrong with asking. I've taught lots of classes where I have a plan and the moves worked in my basement with me, but when I got into the studio, it just didn't flow. So then I asked them, what about that didn't work? And then they tell me, well, it didn't make sense, so we went to this or this, or we couldn't get this move, and then that gives me information. They feel a part of the process, and then I can actually fix it and then see if it works the next time. A competitive and individualistic environment actually occurs in a teacher-centered setting. So you're encouraging and getting everyone to kind of work against each other almost, where you might say, well, 4 people are doing it this way, why aren't you all doing it that way? Or I can do it this way. You need to be doing it like me, making the participants feel uncomfortable and not a part of the group and not a part of the team and not as a piece of the whole. They are felt like they are just individuals on an island on their own, and there's no feeling of confusion or social connection with any of you or the participants. We want to try to avoid that as much as possible. Partner exercise and group counting will bring the group together. This is more student focused. It gets them involved. But it's interesting how the dynamic changes when you get partners working together. People talk more, the energy goes up, the whole feeling of the class changes. Not maybe a good idea to do the entire class of partner exercises, but to sprinkle them in for variety on simple movements. Core exercises done with partners are great. Tubing exercises done with partners are great. On the bike, working in partners and teams is a nice idea. It gives people a chance to connect a different way, and it gives them some support and some encouragement, and maybe they might work a little harder. Group counting, getting them to count down how many left and get them to count out loud is also a way to bring the group together. Don't expect everyone to count. Some people do not like to speak in class, and that's okay. The ones that do like to count, they will count for everybody. They tend to be very loud. And that's much more student-centered. It makes them feel a part of something. Teacher-centered classes and instructors assume that students are passive learners, that they're just sponges to absorb and do, that they have no capacity to experiment, to try things out, to figure it out, to insert things that are different. So when teaching, it's a nice idea to show 3 or 4 options for a move and allow participants to choose which one they want to do. Or if they have a different version, let them do it. They shouldn't feel that they have to do exactly what the instructor does, because it may not be appropriate, it might be too hard or too easy. So encouraging participants to take control of that and to make it their own as much as possible. Everyone learns together is more of a student focus or student-centered philosophy, where you're all kind of in this together, you're a team, and yes, it might look different for each student at the end, but we're all getting to the same place. And it's a process, and everyone, you might not get it the entire workout or the entire movement the first time, but you'll get there eventually, and it's all about the journey for the student. You coach and facilitate in a student-centered environment. You're more of a mentor, more of a giving options, paying attention to what they're doing. You're noticing individuals and making suggestions to them. You're giving them options. You see someone who you know can work harder and looks like they could take on more challenge, you give them more options. You show them something different. Whereas you see someone who looks to be struggling and they're getting tired, their form is starting to go into a poor technique, then you can give them options to make it still challenging but more appropriate for whatever their fitness level is. It really gets down to focusing on the individual at that point. It's more student-centered when the instructor moves around the room and connects with participants, and that just gives that one-on-one coaching philosophy where you're actually paying attention to people, you're giving them options, as opposed to staying in the front of the room and just barking out orders. So really try to give them nice connection and a feeling that they are important in the group. Sometimes teacher-centered instructors are mistaken for getting their own personal workout, where it's disregarding what the participants are. So ways to avoid that is to get away from the front of the room, walk around your class, give encouragement, talk to people, get them, especially on simple holding patterns, where their goal is to turn their brain off and just work. That works in choreography classes, in the cycle room. It's getting them into a challenging or a simple climb or something that they can just kind of turn their resistance up and go. And you're just walking around the room, really making eye contact, giving them encouragement, making suggestions on their technique. In a sport conditioning class, it's walking around and talking to each person as they're doing an exercise. You're staying at one station and that's maybe a bit more complicated, and making sure that they're actually getting into the proper positioning and getting the best bang for their buck for that exercise. So getting away from the front of the room, off the bike, away from the clock, and interacting with your participants is to avoid that impression that you're just there for your own workout. The other thing that is, if someone drops a towel in a cycling class or needs extra equipment, it's like you're getting it for them. It's not about you, it's about them, and you're facilitating their workout that day. Instructor observes class to determine if more difficult moves are appropriate. That's student-centered. So you need to know your participants a little bit and make suggestions. And people might say, no, thank you, and that's fine. But give them the option to make it more difficult or a little bit easy. That's student-centered. This creates a cooperative, relaxed, and supportive environment. You want people to come back because it's fun and they feel safe and that they feel that what you are creating, the workout you're creating, they can do, regardless if they're beginner, intermediate, advanced, or superstar. So making sure that you're creating that kind of environment is a really important key. Finally, a teacher-centered instructor that's basically all about getting the right movement right and performing the correct pattern. It's not about individuals. It doesn't matter if half the room's not getting it. The people close to you are getting it and you're getting it, you're fine. And it's just saying things like, you'll get it eventually, and it's easy, you just have to watch it a few times. That is it's inappropriate, and it's actually more about you than them. So if people aren't getting your pattern or their workout or the movement, you need to figure out a way to break it down differently. You have to teach it differently so that they can actually get it. That goes from a teacher-centered to a student-centered philosophy. So when you're starting out, you might be a little bit more on the teacher side, but trying to think more out of the box and start focusing more on the students as you get more comfortable with instructing and leading groups is a very, very good idea.